First of all, I think experimental filmmaking is something that begins almost by saying it doesn't know what cinema is. Right? So it starts off really without a preconception about what the boundaries of cinema can be. I mean, you could say that the early pioneer filmmakers were all experimental because they didn't know where it was going, and then it kind of settled down in the, I guess from about 1900 to 1920, and became a sort of stable narrative form, and it started to have a way of reaching the public, and so it kind of fixed its boundaries as cinema. But a lot of artists were interested in film for itself, not as cinema. They wanted to make work that used what they didn't know. You know, they wanted to go back in a way to what they didn't know, and to use film that was much more like the way that they were making paintings or sculpture or other kinds of experimental art. And so there's an early period of experimental cinema, starting with the futurists, but you know, in the 20s with Leger and Man Ray and people like this, that they started to they wanted to make films that related to the kind of things which they were doing in the other visual arts. And so for me, the experimental cinema has always been something that begins by not accepting the definition of what the boundaries are, including not accepting the boundaries of its own boundaries of experimental cinema. So experimental cinema, you know, in its present condition, it may not be something that fits necessarily well into the context of the cinema. You know, the presentation place for experimental cinema may not be the cinema. It can be galleries, but it can also be the internet. It could be pieces that you make for images on people's mobile phones. So the boundaries for experimental cinema are always something that are being challenged, and experimental cinema is doing that. It's challenging it, and it's a kind of personal cinema as well. In the main, it doesn't have to be. I mean, I guess there are no dogma. There are no permanent dogmas in experimental cinema, but it tends to be something that comes from individual artists. I think it's another kind of feature of what makes it experimental. It's much more like someone writing a book, painting a picture, that they don't need to get an authorization from some other source. If their instinct tells them that they should do something like this, then within the framework of experimental cinema, in a way, they have permission to do it, and they don't have to fit within any kind of mold. As I said, including the molds that are set by the history of experimental cinema itself. You can step outside those molds as well.
So you could say experimental cinema is dealing with the potentialities of the medium as opposed to its social or economic function.
I think that's right. I mean, one of the things that, in my own history, but it corresponds to some other filmmakers as well. One of the things there's been a tendency to want to be in control of the whole process. Right? I mean, I set up printing and processing equipment, and I wanted to be in control of the process in the same way that I was as a painter or as a musician. And that was important for me, so sorry, do you want to kind of start that question again, because I've lost the thread on the question. Yeah.
The question was, does experimental cinema deal with the cinema's capacities or
yes, right, okay, yes, I know. So in one way, it explores all sorts of aspects of the cinema. One is it explores the production aspects of cinema. So it may take up, as in printing, things that the cinema doesn't see as important, or that only can be done if you approach printing and recoloring or whatever film, transforming the image as a kind of artist gets in and transforms the image, or it can look at the normal situation of cinema and say, okay, I don't want to work with just a single screen. I'm interested. Well, of course, Abel Gance did this in the normal cinema, but the idea that you want to kind of break out from that and make it something that works on 2 or 3 screens. And then some things have to do with not only developing and expanding the technology, they're also to do with misuse of the technology. It's really quite interesting that some of the creative things have come from using the equipment of cinema to do something it was never really designed to do, or certainly the people who made the equipment never thought that anyone would do with it. I mean, for example, when we were doing printing we had an old French debris printer, step printer, and we were taping images in the gate, and it had a track which was there for grading the film, for changing the light levels. It was like a fibre strip with holes punched in it. And the intention of this was to adjust the light levels for each scene, as they do in a normal film production. Instead of that, one of the things that I did, I took a bit of that strip and I just put colour filters in it continuously. And I just moved it by hand as I was printing it. Now, nobody who made that machinery had considered that as a thing to do with that piece of equipment. But when you start to interact with the equipment creatively, without the preconception, then you take it into areas which nobody assumed it would go. So the experimental cinema expands the technology, it expands the use, and in doing that, it also expands the language of cinema. The language of cinema, how you can put one image next to another image, what those images are expected to do to each other. And at the same time, it can open up, as the underground film did, content that isn't permitted in conventional cinema. Lifestyle questions. The kind of first works, I think, that establish gay cinema really comes out of experimental cinema. It doesn't come out of mainstream cinema, because the mainstream cinema can't talk about those things. It certainly can't talk about them in any adventurous way, any overt way, and make them the basis of the content. And so, the experimental cinema is on all levels breaking the fundamental assumptions of and it's less repressed. It's less repressed in the technology. It's less repressed in the content. It's less repressed in the language. So there's this kind of socio-psychological element, and there's a kind of stronger political element. Almost implicitly, experimental film is more challenging politically than even political films made in the conventional cinema.
In what way?
Changes the way people look at and think, rather than changing their opinions. But in the conventional cinema, political content is intended to change people's opinions, change their understanding of something, but it doesn't change the way they think, and it doesn't change the way that they structure their understanding of the world that they live in. And so I used a term in the past that it's a politics of perception. It's a politics of thinking. It can be no political content whatever. It can be utterly abstract. I mean, when you see, it's really interesting that in the Third Reich, the decadent artists, the ones who really couldn't survive in the Third Reich, were the abstract artists, right? They were the ones who were the threat, not because they represented any overt political content. They represented a way of thinking that undermined the dominance of the fascist regime, right? So you don't have to have, it doesn't have to be something that is identifiably in the content for the work to have a radical impact.
So form is political.
Form is form is political.
Political? Is that what you've said that in the past, I think? Or form is a political issue?
Well, yes, I think form is I mean, Godard says this as well, of course. Form and language is a political issue, and perception, the form of experience that you have, not just language. It's the form of and what you value. I mean, when you put something on the screen, you give it value, and if you put a blank screen with a yellow color field slowly changing to a red color field, what do? You give that the experience value. Like you say, this is something that is in your life is worth spending some time with. I mean, almost by definition, if you draw attention to something and put it onto the screen, what you're doing is you're giving that experience value. And that means you give it social value. You give it value in your social and cultural context. And that's political, and it doesn't have to have a political content. I think it's true. I think it's sad that it's true, and I'm not sure what you do about that. I mean, I think as an artist, you have to work with what it is that you think is the right thing to do. And what you think is the right thing to do is not just idiosyncratic and to do with you. It is a cultural activity and it is a social activity. I mean, the tradition of the avant-garde, I'm not sure if that's the same thing as experimental, is that whatever they are doing, they see as at the front of thinking and culture, and at the front of thinking and society. And in that sense, the avant-garde, it was linked to political developments and social developments, and they never separated it. The avant-garde always saw this as, by definition, that's what's meant by the avant-garde. Now, the avant-garde is always going to produce forms which don't immediately match what people expect. I mean, if you were a mathematician or an experimental biologist, and you were doing some kind of development in biology or in mathematics, and you put the paper out to the public, they wouldn't understand it, right? Because it's a development where the public needs to know that language in order to be able to make sense of what, and the more challenging it is, the more likely it is that it's not going to make immediate contact. Now that is a problem, implicit problem in the avant-garde. In the art world, you've got a kind of device for dealing with this, because most artists are kind of way out there, and they don't so much make contact with the public as to make contact with the cognoscenti. They make contact with the collectors. They make contact with the galleries. They make contact with the people who run public art galleries, who are all, as it were, trained as intellectuals around that work. But it doesn't, on the whole, make contact with the general public. I mean, the public artworks are sort of slightly changing that. But there is a problem that we think artworks are making, because they're getting paid for by public galleries and so on, are making contact with the general public. In many cases, they're not. They're making contact with people who know about art. They're going into collections, and then people are seeing them, and because they're validated by being in that collection, then to some extent, the public is taking them seriously. But in some ways, a kind of advanced artwork, almost by definition, is going to have a difficult time with the public. And that isn't, I mean, I'd love to be an entertainer and I'd like to meet a general, and I sort of envy rock musicians who are doing, some people are doing exceptionally good work as musicians. It's just, it holds up perfectly well with any other kind of music, and they can meet a public. The experimental filmmakers, particularly more than experimental artists in general, have a difficult time with this, because there isn't an institution that's, as it were, protecting them and taking it out to the public and giving the public a way of taking it seriously. I mean, that little heyday of Channel 4 was very interesting, because they were doing these experimental work on television late at night, but it was building an audience. That isn't happening now, but you've got, in a way, it has to establish that context in which people can understand it. And it's not easy. It's so different in many ways. What I'm doing, what other people in experimental cinema are doing, so different from what goes on in cinema. It actually isn't so different from what's going on in the art world, but it's often very different from what's going on in cinema. And the people who are looking, who'd like to go to cinema, they're expecting a certain kind of content. It fulfills a certain psychological function for them. It repeats a certain sort of psychological experience which they want. It's like anything else that becomes part of your habit. And experimental cinema doesn't satisfy that. In fact, frequently it opposes it. It's actually deliberately is opposing that, and so it does have a difficulty with the public in that sense. They're not bad. I mean, I've never had problems really with showing my work. Whenever I've got an audience in and I've shown my work, I've never had a problem about people not responding well to it. And fortunately, at the moment, there are a number of screenings that are going on that we're getting very good audiences. People are really interested in the work, and I don't feel that marginalised. And I don't think it's necessary to be marginalised, and I certainly would like to make contact. And I like the idea, I mean, many of the presentations I make, I actually meet the public. I actually talk to them about what I'm doing. Artists tend not to do that. They put the thing on the wall, or they put the piece of sculpture in the gallery. They go to the private view, have a drink or two, and then push off. They don't come and meet the public, If you look at abstract painting, abstract painting is still about the human condition, right? Nothing is not about the human condition. If I make a work that doesn't have an image of a person in it, it's still about people. The people are looking at the work. The people are making the work. You can't escape the human condition. It's simply that you're creating a different relationship between you and representation. And I made an argument, I don't know that I believe it entirely, but the history of 20th century painting is a history of the rejection of illusory representation. The painting is no longer, the frame of the painting is no longer a window behind which something is represented. It was replaced by the surface of the canvas being the surface on which things happened and were present. You were in the same space as the spectator as the things that were happening on the canvas, and they were happening there and then, not at some previous position in a previous time. So they weren't representational. Film, in its normal form, has never escaped that. Film is still a window. When you go to a cinema, everything that happens is not on the screen, it's behind the screen. And everything that happens in its production is before you come to view it, right? All the events are both in the narrative, illusory previous time, but they also, the production time, They're always there somewhere in the past. And so it doesn't begin from the condition of presence. And one of the things that experimental cinema did was to establish that position that the screen is the surface on which things happen. You can then, to some extent, you can then have representation, but the representation is on the screen and it's present, and it's not representing an action that's taken place in the past. And so one of the big problems is that, for me, cinema has never become a 20th century medium. It's a 19th century medium, it's a 19th century language. Even with the most advanced of the art filmmakers, I'm thinking of Truffaut and René and people like that, and Bergman, and it's remained in most of its aspects a 19th century medium, and it's never been existentialist. There's never been there's virtually no example of a first-person cinema within conventional cinema. You don't have the thing that became very important in literature and in 20th century art in general, that the subjective position of the maker is synonymous with the thing which takes you through the narrative. Now you get representations of the first person, you get representations of the existential position with Godard and people like that, but the work itself is not existentialist. So some of the key points of philosophical change in the 20th century have never embodied themselves in the dominant film language. They've only got a representation if you take that other history of the underground film, where you can, Brakhage is a first-person filmmaker. He's an existentialist filmmaker. Warhol, these people, their 20th century works, they don't preclude representation, but representation is one aspect, and it's on the surface and now, which, if you take a painter like Robert Rauschenberg, for example, Robert Rauschenberg, when he makes an image that is a photographic or an illusory image, that image sits on the canvas. It doesn't represent something that you go through a window as if it were an illusion of something. It's both present and a representation, and its representation isn't an illusion. And so this is a very problematic thing in cinema and in television. That we use television as a way for us to enter a kind of fantasy world. And the experimental cinema may be interested in fantasy worlds, but it's not used. It's interested in the creative aspect of fantasy, but it's not used to take you into a fantasy world as a substitute for your own existence. Do you see what I mean? And that's a big problematic difference. Verite, truth, yeah. Well, again, it's something I've thought about a lot, that the difference between truth and fact and document and documentary. A documentary tends to take images and put a construction on them, which gives you a narrative, some kind of constructed understanding. That's not the same thing as document. A document is something where the trace you have is a trace that came from a very particular situation right now. We know what a document is if it's written. Of course, documents can be faked. People in the Soviet Union were airbrushed out of history. They can be faked. You can fake documents. But and in one way, the cinema, the individual image in a cinema is a document of that moment of its production. But it's, as all documents, its limits as evidence are very strict. You can't see beyond the frame. You can't see if there's after an obstruction. You can only see things that are within the compass of that film stock, the level of resolution. If it's black and white, you can't see the color of something. And you don't know what, and this is more important, you don't know what happened before that shot starts and after that shot ends, right? So as evidence, the truth and evidence are kind of very close together. I mean, when I made After Lumiere, the film that I showed last night, this is about evidence, right? That film is its main subject is the problematics of evidence. What can you know and what can't you know? And what do you know from seeing something from this viewpoint? And then, you know, the last section of it where you come at it from a different viewpoint, where, you know, you've had to reassess you've seen the thing 3 times from an approximately the same viewpoint, but often with slightly different camera actions. And you think you know the event, and you get bored because you think, oh, this is a repetition. And then you get another viewpoint on it, which looks like, in the first instance, that this solves the problem. But that viewpoint is equally specific. So as document, you've got what the semiologists call indexical signifiers. You know, it's something that is a trace of something. But in cinema, everything that's done in cinema is done to destroy the documental aspect of the image, right? Everything that can be done is done to stop you knowing the real truth about how that image was produced, right? So in that sense, the question of illusion and I don't know that there's an exact opposition between truth and illusion. And I'm not sure whether I'm talking about truth. I'm talking about how can we know what we know? Isn't quite the same thing as truth. I'd rather use the term evidence than truth. Because in a sense, a truth can be a lie. Something that is a lie can be, at another level, a greater truth. We know all that stuff from kind of literature and philosophy and, you know, mythology and so on. So for me, a mythology is a mythological construction is a kind of truth, but it's not a truth in the sense that it relates to fact. And when you get, you know, the real problem is the truth related to, for example, political events and political coverage and media coverage. We know that you can't rely on something that is filtered to us through the media, but you never can. You always have to be in a position of skepticism. For me, another function of the experimental cinema is to maintain a condition of skepticism. Not cynicism, that's a different thing. It's not cynical, it's skepticism. You've always got to be in the position of saying, well, you know, how do I assess whether this is something I can rely on or not rely on? I mean, there's a lovely film by John Smith called A Girl Chewing Gum. Beautiful film. I mean, every person who makes documentaries should look at this film. And in this film, there's a commentary about this event that's in front of the camera. And the commentary starts to act like it's telling the people what to do. Well, it's a piece of work which has been video, and of course he's telling them what to do after the event. And you know, you get a real kind of engagement. It doesn't say there is no truth. What it says is truth is always problematic, right? And that's the thing, it's problematic. And the experimental cinema, in a way, is always saying there are limits to what we can know, and there are limits to the truth we can give you. It's always problematic. And you as the spectator are then having to position yourself in relationship, including the subjective thing of the existential filmmaker. When you see my work or Brackage's work or whatever, you can't rely on what I'm giving you as being something that is a truth you can take. You've got to position yourself always. That's my take on truth. I mean, it is complicated. I've been associated in the past with a strong anti-narrative position, and I have to temper that a little bit. What I would say now is that narrative is one form of modelling amongst a number. Okay, it's not that narrative is false. It's one system. The construction, understanding of reality, understanding of experience as being like a causal chain of events, one causing another and leading to another, usually with some moral outcome. I mean, even if it's amoral, it's actually, there's a moral to the story. You don't have many stories that don't have some moral to them, right? Some point to make. And they're always within an ideology, that's another thing. So it isn't that narrative is of itself false. The problem is our reliance on it as one system for understanding experience. And my problem with narrative comes mainly from it doesn't match well with my experience. It's not that it's a, you know, I've got anything against it as it doesn't match with the, it's not a very good way for me to understand how my life works. My life doesn't work by that kind of consequential narrative. Little bits of it might, and I tell myself stories and I'll listen to stories, and we tell each other stories in order to, you know, what did you do last night? Well, this is what I did. And you tell the story and that looks like a thread, but there's all kinds of stuff that's going on around you that don't get into that story. And then the person you were with last night, and they're sitting down telling somebody it's a completely different story, or it's certainly sufficiently different you don't necessarily know that they were in the same place with you. And so the problem with the narrative is it's kind of much too limited linear passage through experience. And I've been looking for a long time, started in a way by being strongly anti-narrative, realizing that even if I wasn't narrative, everything I did had a dramaturgy, right? Even though I wasn't narrative, my films were structured, and it mattered that you saw the beginning before you saw the end. You know, they had a kind of developmental structure, but they weren't narrative, and so I kind of was rethinking that. And then I did a lot of stuff actually saying, okay, well, what is it that's going on in narrative? The forms of identification, the psychological relationships that narrative is built on. I did a lot of theoretical work on that. But at the same time, I was looking for, there was an element that was looking for something that I could best call multi-narrative or multi-dimensional narrative. And multi-dimensional narrative doesn't look like conventional narrative. I mean, what is on the screen in the Cyclops series, a kind of narrative, but it's so multi-layered through superimpositions, through different viewpoints, three screens, through repetition and reworking, and with no clear consequence. There's a broad structure, but there's no clear consequential development. You have to pick these little components, clusters. Clusters is a good word. They used to use it in jazz. You know, you pick up these clusters, and those clusters could be placed back there in, you know, your construction of that time and space is much more like a three-dimensional or multi-dimensional space, where what you're seeing now doesn't mean this happened after that. It didn't mean that it happened as a consequence of that. It means that those things have a way, you know, they may kind of come together. That little sequence or cluster and this little cluster will talk to each other across time, right? And your passage through them is like linear, but it's a wriggly line, and it's a line that takes a number of kind of detours along the way. And so it isn't non-narrative in that sense. It's much more like it's a more complex form of narrative, and where narrative and symbol and symbolization and myth and allegory are kind of there not as consequential temporal structures, right? And I think it's more complex than narrative. It's not simpler, it's more complex. I don't know whether it's a golden age, but it's certainly, I mean, some of the things that concerned us a lot, which was cost and access to the means of production in the Marxist kind of terms, that concerned us a great deal in the 60s. And, you know, we set up filmmakers' workshops and rooted around for cheap stock and support structures for making work and ways of making work cheaply and so on. That issue almost doesn't exist now. It's you can get most people now in our culture. Not talking about someone in a village in Africa. We can get together the facilities for putting a film together but putting films together, not a film, just putting videos together for less than we would pay to furnish a room, right? For the furniture and the carpets, and we can with $2,500 we can pretty much get a production centre together, and the production costs are minimal unless you're trying to do something that is fitting into the conventions of cinema, where you've got to have lighting and crew and actors, and you've got to pay them, and you're in a different sort of business. But the digital makes video and filmmaking much more like it was to be an author, a poet, a musician, a painter. You've got pretty much the things you need to do it to hand. Doesn't mean that you'll produce a great work of art. That's another question. But that basic thing of access and being able to, having the facility to make work is now not such a problem, and that can mean that we can get a much more plural visual cinematic culture, and I welcome that. I mean, it's one of the things that, in a way, I work towards. Is what was part of the ideology of my early work, was to open it up and make it less precious and more available to people, much more like writing. So, I mean, yes, I think that does do that. It's at the same, it's got bits of downside as well, but I mean, it's become much more the centre of our culture. The cinematic, we used to we would get it only by going to the cinema. Now it's fully available to us on television, and we live a visual culture. We have the means to not just hear and understand, as we do with listening to people's words, but we can speak it. I mean, we now can speak it. So our literacy it's not a one-way literacy. It used to be a one-way literacy. Film studies were always about film appreciation, right? In the 60s, film courses were film appreciation courses. Critical, not filmmaking. There are very few filmmaking courses. And we assumed literacy was how to read films, right? But we don't expect literacy in the other fields to stop with reading books. We expect people to be able to go and write if they want to. So we've got, film has now come into that position that the other arts enjoyed before before cinema. They enjoyed that. It wasn't difficult to make to write a novel if you had a novel in you. Came into filmmaking was painting and visual arts and jazz music. I wasn't unaware of what was going on in cinema. I was watching, as a student, I watched all the Truffaut and René and Chris Marker and people like that, and the European art cinema. And I was, like everyone else, I knew the Hollywood cinema. I would, went to the films like anybody. And I also, at the Slade, there was a film course run by an old British film director, Thorold Dickinson, and I used to go to his presentations. So I saw, a pretty wide range of film. But when I came into filmmaking, I knew I didn't want to make films like that. I wanted to make something else. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I knew I didn't want to make films like that. I wanted to do something much more continuous with art. And one of the things about that was the way in which in art you actually handle the whole process. I used to do etchings and prints, and I would do the whole process, and you took it for granted. That was normal. And when I started to make my first 16mm film, I sent stuff into the labs, and it came back, and I sent it to the labs again, and I didn't like that process. It was like, I had something, and I didn't want that. I wanted to be able to control it. Also, it was very expensive. So it just happened that, I mean, quite foolishly, really, with a long-term friend of mine, David Curtis, who was running the arts laboratory at Drury Lane, the first arts laboratory, and we're talking about 1967. We just talked about this, and we came up with the idea that we needed a filmmakers workshop that wasn't like just editing, it was also printing and processing. And neither of us, and certainly not me, knew anything about film or even photography technology, really. So quite foolishly, with blinkers, you know, I decided that I would make filmmaking equipment. And with a man called Ben Yahya, who was come from America, going over in Europe and then going on to the Six-Day War, taking film, we built the first bit of film processing equipment, which was a drum processor. We had the film wrapped, and we shot film and processed it and then hung it up to dry. And it worked reasonably, but not well. We didn't know what the hell we were doing. And then I thought, okay, well, you know, I'll try and make a printer. And so I got an old projector, and I converted it to take two, you know, the negative and the print film, put a different bulb in with a rheostat, and in a red light, because we were working with black and white, not colour, I started printing from found footage and stuff that I'd shot, and I did all sorts of printing experiments, including some printing experiments where I laid film on top of raw material and under glass and exposed it to light and then cut those pieces together. So I started to do that, and those bits I could dip process. But then I thought I need a continuous processor. And so I made a continuous processor. I made it was about this big, about that big, and it had developer in a plastic bucket, then fixer, then water for washing, and then another water. So 4 tanks, the last 2 were wash. Then it came up from there and through a wooden channel with a hairdryer, and the hairdryer dried it so that when it spooled up, it was dry. And I mean, I can't imagine how lucky I was, but it worked. You know, there was, right from the first run, it worked. It was incredibly slow. I had to sit with it, you know, if I did more than 400 or 500 feet, I'd be sitting there for 2 or 3 hours, because you had to kind of sit there with it. You couldn't just leave it running. And it was made of wood, painted with polyurethane, plastic spools, drain pipe. It came around on bits of drain pipe held on 8mm spools. Meccano with Pirelli webbing around to take the film through. I mean, it was completely Heath Robinson, but it worked. But it wasn't robust enough for other filmmakers to use. And I did my first 2 years year and a half of film. I made about 6 or 8 films on this. Quite long, some quite long ones. I made a 40-minute film on it, 2-screen 40-minute film. And so, you know, I did this, but it didn't fulfill the thing of providing a filmmaker's workshop. The objective was to do that. So then, through David Curtis, we managed to get contact with an American financier who was an art financier. I mean, he financed some art things. He brought the Living Theatre to London. And he had money. He made money on the stock exchange, and he liked art. And we managed, David and I, but mainly David, persuaded him that you know, he might put some money into helping us to establish a filmmakers workshop. And he gave us £3,000. There's another narrative related to that, but I won't go into that. And I went and collected this £3,000 in a brown envelope and bought a printing machine from a laboratory that were, you know, it was an old printing machine, but it worked perfectly well. And a developing machine that was a design. It was huge. It was about a 2 tons stainless steel developing machine from a company that had developed, had invented these for going out with the military for processing film in the field. And they, it was like something that would go on the back of a truck, but it was pretty enormous. And we installed that in successively 3 different arts laboratories, or the Film Co-op. And that then did work as the basis for a filmmaker's workshop. And I would say 70 or 80% of the films made in the UK, experimental films made in the UK between 1960, end of 67 and the end of the 70s, almost all of them were made on that equipment, and people learned how to. I processed stuff. I still have my printer books, which tells me what I did and what light levels I was using. People like Sally Potter, for example, Sally Potter owes me £14, right? Like, this was for the film stock. And, we were processing stuff, printing and processing stuff. And if it was colour, we printed it and sent that for processing, because we couldn't do that. We never could process colour. But we could print colour and we could experiment with colour. So that was, we got into film equipment complete primitives. We had no idea what we were doing. I didn't even know the relationship between development time and exposure time. I'd never done photography. So we can't, the fools rush in where angels fear to tread. We just did it, and we were fortunate that it worked. And the Film Co-op certainly took off, and the Film Co-op workshop was a major force in the development of an experimental film culture in the UK. It became increasingly less important, and recently, when the Film Co-op packed up, and it became the Lux, and the Lux took over the equipment, and then the Lux went bust. It's got a phoenix now. It's back again and working well, but they decided not to take this film equipment along. And people were saying to me, "Isn't it a tragedy?" And I said, "No, it's not. We don't need it anymore. Nobody wants. Only a few people are going to produce with that. If anybody wants to, if there are enthusiasts who want to take that equipment, you shouldn't sell it to them. Give it to them. It really isn't." It's not a big issue, and most the time had passed. It was essential for a certain period. It changed the aesthetic as well within that period, but basically that moment lasted 10 years or more. Probably had its effect for a good 10 to 15 years. But it was the core of that explosion of experimental filmmaking in the UK, in Britain. As a result of that, the processes of filmmaking became an integral part of the language. Particularly for me, this thing of transforming the image. I guess if I'm really talking about philosophically, what it did was, it shifted us even further from the pro-filmic to the image on the film strip. Right? The image on the film strip became the primary question. And then, when it was projected, the projection environment became the primary question. Right? So it shifted. It was another part of that modernist thing that we talked about the way in which the canvas becomes the surface. This was a way in which the film material and the material going through the projector and the material of the light being projected on the screen and the film as being shadow from the light being stopped by certain, the film went back to being shadows, right, as a result of this, because we were involved in the process. And for me, that from that point, I think I was always involved in the process, and that carried through. When I was making video, I was always interested in, the processes. And then with the digital, I began in the digital I made my first digital work in 1969, right? And that was with a big national computer at the Atomic Energy Establishment, which had a cathode ray tube and a camera mounted above it. But I had to learn to program to do that. I had to learn, there's no software. You wrote a program that did all the tasks. It sent the electron beam around the cathode ray tube. It moved the film camera on a frame and generated you had to write the program which would control this equipment and generate the image, because there was no software for it. There wasn't ready-made software, so I had to learn Fortran 4. Then I put the digital on the back burner, though I still was writing about it and kind of interested in it, and I was interested in other relations of technology. When I came back into digital, I mean, again, I came in not quite at the right but almost with the Sinclair Spectrum and then the Atari. But I still had to program. There was nothing off the shelf that was doing what you would want to do. I had to program. With the Sinclair Spectrum, this is very esoteric, but I had to program in what was called machine code, and machine code is just a series of numbers telling what the central processing unit what to do, right? And a machine code program is like enormously long, and it's just numbers. And you have to know what each of these numbers, and if you get one of them out of sequence, the whole thing collapses, right? And there's no error testing. So writing programs on the Sinclair Spectrum was a nightmare. But then when I did the Atari, I was still programming, and I was making, writing programs that controlled or generated the image and controlled or generated the sound output. But I was still having to write programs. So because they didn't exist at that moment, there wasn't now we're kind of inundated with software that will modify the image and do all sorts of stuff, and we can use that software. But at that moment, and we're talking not that much further ago than in the early 1980s, right? At that time, you couldn't rely on there being software. And also, computers only came into the visual relatively late. I mean, the Apple Mac sort of came in around the early 80s. But prior to that, there were only experiments in the visual in computers. IBM were getting experimental filmmakers like Stan Van Der Beek and John Whitney were working with IBM, helping them to develop what would be needed for visual representation on the screen. And so it was pre-representational, really. There wasn't a system for making representational pictures in the digital. So I've always, in that sense, come in, for me, like someone like Abel Gance or whatever, I've always needed to make some technological development as well as making the visual thing. I don't think that is as critical a question for me. I mean, I could live, if there were no technological innovations from the present condition of digital cinema until I died, I wouldn't feel too disturbed. There's plenty I can do with where we are. So I'm not so, although, I'm still doing things that are pressing the technology in the sense of 3-screen video or whatever, but slightly on the fringe of where the technology is. But it's not big technological innovation. And I certainly don't think that experimental cinema is defined by its technological innovation. It's not just about creating different effects. It really isn't. It's about different meanings. This was very simple, actually. This was one of the more simple pieces, and it's not digital. I mean, this was it started almost as an accident. I started to make a new work, and I thought, at the beginning of the work will just be color fields changing through the spectrum, which is where I've started on a number of other things. I've always a lot of my work is interested in this spectrum color change, slow or different speeds of spectrum color change. So I started to do that, and I generated, and this was digital, a series of color fields going through the spectrum and dissolving them across each other. And I was recording this on beta. It wasn't on digital, it was on beta. There was a digital frame store to make the color fields and so on, but it wasn't digital. And I was just rewinding the beta, and I saw this rollover pattern and the effect that it made on the, you got this optical color left between the, and different rollover patterns. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And so I recorded the rewind, and then I re-recorded, and I recorded at different speeds, and built up a sort of bank of these images. And then I thought, okay, I'll be interested in putting one inside the other. And I had a simple analog effects mixer, which allowed me to separate the first layer, and then I superimposed another layer, another pass. And then I kind of, I made a version of it, and a friend of mine had made some music, and I took that music and I put the things together, and I thought, okay, I'll start cutting this to the music. Then I thought it'd be nice to do this on 3 screens, and I'll kind of work the thing across. And then I thought, well, what actually would be interesting is if the outer screens began to develop a matching diagonal, right? And moving up to eventually the vertical, right? So there were 3 stages of between the horizontal and the vertical. So then I reshot it with a camera on the angle, just reshot it from the screen, and then did superimpositions of that, and then with the basic material, I cut it so that there was the section was going on in the middle would be the same piece as going on here, but in a slightly different, and then the left screen might be a little different from the right screen, and so you get these other, but it built up entirely by responding to the previous stage, so there wasn't a plan to it. It was like a piece of music that built up. You see, and so I was responding to what was happening, and I didn't know it was going to come out like that. It was only that when I saw this, I just thought, that's interesting. What it's doing to your eye is interesting, and I never began thinking I'm going to do a piece about rollover, right? Of course, in a sophisticated situation, I knew how it related to my previous work. I knew how it related to other filmmakers like Paul Sharits. I had my reference, and I knew how it related to the visual arts. I knew how it related to abstract painting, color field paintings, to Rothko, right? I mean, I kind of knew that I was working in a language. I was working in relationship to other people's work and in a language. Doesn't come out of the blue. It does come out of the blue, but it doesn't come out of the blue, It comes out of, when you're working on it, and that supports the sense of it, right? And so it has no story, but it has the physicalness. And it's a physical piece, and it's about physical response, and the sound should be quite high, actually. It's a club piece. I've shown this not in separately from this. I've shown it in a kind of club situation. I'm very happy to show this as a club piece. I'd be very happy if there was a way of things like that working in a different context to cinema, much more public context. That should be on the wall in a gallery. Knock a lot of the abstract paintings right off the wall. And it relates to Oscar Fischinger, early Fischinger work. So, I know where it goes. I'm not in isolation from that, and I don't pretend that I'm doing something that's absolutely entirely new. What's interesting for me is that the sophistication comes from building on this other kind of history of the language, I've done 2 screen work, I've done 3 screen work, I've done 4 screen films, I've done 6 screen work. They each have their characteristics. The three screen is a triptych, and it does have a tradition in religious work. There is something about a triptych. Of course, the triptych has this centrality and like the kind of side screens. But that doesn't happen with a four screen work, especially if they're in a square, right? So, you know, four screens don't have that triptych quality. Three screens always have some kind of triptych quality, and maybe, you know, there's a Kabbalistic thing, but that Kabbalistic thing is related to our perceptions, because you can't look at the three screen film without there being this kind of symmetricalness. The four screen film isn't symmetrical in the same way. It's not like a triangle, it's like a square. And then, you know, I've done 5 screen, but 6 screen then takes on this. So you could do a kind of theoretical crystallography of multi-projection work. And they do have their own character. And for this work, I was interested in what happened with 3 screen. Perceptual psychology, it's more about conceptual psychology, I think. I might be completely wrong about this. And that is this thing of how we look at it in terms of making the relationships. And is this the same as this? And if it's not, why is it different? And what are those differences and how do they work? Particularly in the more, is that okay? Particularly in the more symbolic work. You know, you've got this kind of, these little symbolic developments, and how do they relate to each other, and why aren't they the same, and are they delaying a little bit behind? And you know, then that delight, there's a delight when, you know, one is a little behind the other, and then they come together, and the screens kind of really answer each other. And it's like in music, you know, where you get the, you know, 2 or 3 threads of the music, and then, you know, there's the point when they come together in the same melodic or harmonic structure. And so it's a bit like that. It's again constructed a bit like music. And I'm working on a 4-screen piece now. Well, that's different, and I'm not sure, you know, at this moment, I'm not sure whether I'll show them 4 in a block, or whether I'll show 2 on one wall and 2 on another wall, or whether there'll be a gap between them. It's more about, I think, I may be wrong, it's more for me about how you're checking the relationships. I don't think it through. I kind of make a decision instinctively, but that instinctive decision is based on having had previous experience of it. So, I guess in a sense, I am making a decision. I know that the next piece I want to make is 4-screen, and I don't want to make it as a 3-screen work, right? I know that, and I know why. I don't want this symmetry. I want a different kind of checking, and I know how a 4-screen film works, and certainly I know how a 4-screen film works when it's 1, 2, 3, 4, because I've done a piece like that. I know how it works, and I know what goes on in that. And I'm not at this moment, I don't think I want to do the next piece like that. So what I'm doing is I'm saying I did it like this, something of that is what I want, but it isn't completely, and then I kind of think my way through it as I make it. You know, it's a practice. You think your way through, and you can't preconceive it. I mean, I'm very suspicious for my own practice. I don't mean as a general principle, but maybe it is. I'm very suspicious of purely conceptual work. Like artists who seem able to make a total decision up front, and then they could even farm it out for other people to construct it. And I'm very nervous about that, because I can't see how they can predict the experience to that degree, right? I don't understand how they can do it. They can't visualize the subtleties of the relation. And for me, it is about experience. And being honest about it, it's also about spectacle. I like work like this because it's a spectacle, because it's encompassing, and it's a bit like the way in which music, fills the space. I do like the scale. I don't want to show this at a small scale. I don't want to show this as 3 monitors. I don't want to show it. I've got a version of it where, just for documentation purposes, where it's all on one and it's like the 3 screens are all on one, and it's too small, and I don't like it, and you know, and you've got these, and if you blow it up, you're going to lose resolution. But so it is also about spectacle and scale. It's about being inside being to some extent having it reaching the edges of your perception. So those things are important, but they're intuitive isn't quite the right word. It just means that I'm making decisions, but based on such a large amount of data that it's not a single decision, and it's not a single conceptual decision. And it is about having a sense of what the experience is going to be. For me, it's all about experience. I'm not interested in artworks that aren't about experience. I want the experience to have a conceptual, intellectual element to it, but it's not a demonstration or illustration of a concept. It's about an experience. We used to talk about expanding consciousness. I mean, I'm not sure I go along with that. I think we don't expand anything very much, but what we do is we create new forms of how we relate experience to knowledge, or how we relate experience to action and ideology. For me, I can't think what else this is about if it isn't about that. You know, this isn't about me kind of just playing around. I mean, that's a very important source of the creativity, but that isn't what it's about. What it's about is inserting something into the world that represents a new way of thinking. Not necessarily totally new, but it, you know, reinforces a different approach to thinking, and that's what it's about. That's why the question about whether it represents human beings or not seems to me to be irrelevant, because we are the human beings. We, the audience and the makers, are the human beings, and it's acting on us. We are the subject. The subject isn't what's represented in the main. We are the subject. The subject. We are the what this is about. We who are looking at it are what this is about, and about how we then go from there to the next point in our life. And that's what I think it's about. And you're constructing something, and you're acting. I mean, you are the representative of the audience. You, the artist, are the representative of the audience in taking a concept, an idea, or a position forward. And you present it to them, and they can take it or not as they like. But basically, it's only of interest if it does something that it represents a new position. And not just a new position. I'd go a little further than that. I mean, without being avant-gardist and progressive. I'm also very interested in sustainability in the human condition in general, and in the international, global. I want to do something in my work with the way I behave in my work, ethically even, aesthetically, ethically, that actually, if it became part of the culture, would help the world to move towards a greater human stability, right? I mean, so I don't want to overblow that ambition, but I do think about that. What I'm thinking about is, how does this matter in the world? Why is it important? What does it contribute to getting rid of this idiocy of conflict and inequality, and how does it contribute to that? And I do think about that, and I do test what I'm doing by that, and I try to work ethically in my relationship to the audience, and in my relationship to anyone I collaborate with in the work, in relationship to the technicians who help me put it up. I think I've got an ethical responsibility, which is to do with the proper relationships of one human being to another. And I hope that is built into the work. I mean, it's very problematic, again for me, in Hollywood cinema, that the film may represent something laudable, but the ethical relationships in the production are absolutely appalling. You know, and the way in which the people are treated, and the way in which the audience is treated as, you know, the condescension to the audience. And, you know, I find that absolutely unacceptable. And so it's the part of even the practice of working in this you know, not being involved with raising huge amounts of money, not doing things that are kind of, you can only make a Hollywood movie if Hollywood agrees with what you do. You know, they'll allow a little criticism on the fringes, and there are some independents who are capable of putting a package together and can do it. I mean, you know, it's not all of the people from the commercial cinema succumb to that entirely, but to a large extent, I think it's very difficult to have that sort of humanistic position that is not only in what is represented, but is all the way through the way in which the process and production works, and is I think is then inscribed in the process. Actually, I think this ethical position becomes subtly inscribed in the work itself as a part of its semiology. I actually think it's there as part of its semiology. The process gets into it as part of the signs and symbols in the work, actually, if you know how to read it. And their converse is written into the commercial cinema on the whole. Because I don't believe in nature, but I don't think any, you know, I can't remember when the last time when you could look at something and say that is an unfiltered nature. I mean, it's very tricky. Yes, I do respond to the beauty of a natural environment. Whatever, I don't know how to express it other than that. You know, this morning in the hotel, the sun coming up, you know, it was absolutely gorgeous. And I used to live in San Francisco, and I'd go across the Bay Bridge in the car in the morning, and every day. So, I mean, but I don't. It's still coded, right? That's culturally coded. Some of it isn't. I mean, I suspect that what we call abstract art, that abstraction is allowing moments where you respond physically to the senses outside of codification, outside of the semiological. And you know, I think that's in you know, in the rhythm and the music. There's a kind of element of that which is sheer physical pleasure, right? Sheer physical pleasure. And it happens in music. I mean, we use our ears for hearing people speak and for utilitarian things, but a whole range of stuff has been created for us culturally, or we've created culturally, which has no utilitarian purpose whatever, right? You can use it in a utilitarian way, but no, it's only there for the kind of pleasure of that. And if you listen to a sound, that sound is pleasurable, right? There's something in the sound itself, whatever it means. And you can see it with children. You know, children have that. They can have that pleasure. And I think that there's an element of that is in colour. But associations with landscape, I guess, is to do with, it's much more psychological and more coded. You know, that kind of open, beautiful landscape represents a sort of a period of untension and somewhere where, you know, where those sorts of tensions and problems of one's cultural, social existence are somehow don't have to be dealt with. But I'm not unaware of that. But so I mean, my relationship to it as nature, I wouldn't stress it as nature. I know it's filtered, and I know it's already symbolic. I mean, for example, the piece with the cherry tree, right? The cherry tree. Why is a cherry tree beautiful? You know, the pink against the blue sky. Well, but at the same time, it's a symbol. You know, it's symbolic of spring. It's symbolic of that point in time. You know, you see the blossom coming out, and you're going from winter into summer, and that brings a kind of enthusiasm, right? And it's coded. And how do I get the time to do that, right? I'm fortunate. I'm living in the country. Some people would never see that even, and so I know that's all coded. I don't think my relationship to nature isn't one of simply saying, that's beautiful, or at least if it is, I've got to think about it a bit. But I do respond to it as beautiful, and I do like the sensual sumptuousness of colour and deep, layered sound, and I like those physical things. And in that sense, it is aesthetic, and it is about beauty, I guess. Only because we haven't got a better word for it than beauty. Maybe I've just become an old reactionary. So I guess the thing that in this piece that counteracts that is the Afghanistan piece. That's in there to counteract that sort of element of beauty, really, to make it more problematic. There's some things which are very personal to me, and I may not be right either. I can do things which somebody else coming along and say, that's reinforcing all the wrong things at this moment. I can't control that, because I can only make it from my position. But I don't go on in a kind of megalomaniac way to say, and I am right. I can be wrong, right? I don't know why those things happen. I shot this. What I didn't want was the camera that was just taking the screen. I had the camera touching the screen in most of the, it's actually on a wide angle touching the screen. So it's right up as close to the screen as it can get, and there's a sound coming in. Again, I can't say I know why I did it. I just was sitting there, and I went and got my camera. I hardly even thought about it, except the discipline of, I was feeling very kind of comfortable and lazy, and I had a glass of wine or something, and this was going on, and a thought came in, and I went and got my camera and did it. I just did this, and I kept running it because something in me said, do that. Something in there said, do it, and I went and did it. And then when I looked at the material, and you can see from when it's on the screen, I got really interested in, for example, where the words were continuous across all three screens.